Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine waking up before the sun, not because you want to, not because there is something exciting waiting for you, but because if you don't, someone will come to the door, someone will knock, and your mother, with tired eyes and trembling hands, will open it before you even have the chance to pretend you are still sleeping. You are 7 years old, maybe 8, and the day, your entire day, already belongs to someone else. This is not a story from a distant land. This is not something that happened in a forgotten corner of the world that has nothing to do with you. This happened here, in America, in the mills that line the rivers of New England, in the red brick buildings of Pennsylvania, in the cotton towns of the Carolinas, where the air smells of fiber and machine oil and something else, something harder to name, something like lost time, something like stolen childhood. Between 1870 and 1910, more than 2 million children were working in American factories. 2 million small bodies inside buildings designed for machines, not for people. 2 million pairs of hands moving through the dark, reaching into places adults couldn't reach, fingers slim enough to untangle the threads, and the looms had to keep running, always, because the fabric was cheap, and the demand was high, and the children were cheaper still. Stay with me, because what I am about to tell you is not comfortable. It is not meant to be, but it is necessary, because these children existed. They breathed, they dreamed, they had names, and for too long, history spoke about the machines they operated without speaking about the lives those machines consumed. Today, we speak about the lives. You are watching this, perhaps on a warm afternoon, perhaps with a cup of something beside you, and that comfort, that ordinary, beautiful comfort, is precisely the reason this story matters, because someone, once, didn't have it, and they were your age when they lost it, or they were your child's age, or your grandchild's, and knowing their story is the least we can do to honor the weight of what they carried. If this already touches something in you, leave a comment below. Tell me what you feel as we begin this journey together, because this is not just history, this is memory, and memory, when spoken aloud, becomes alive again, like these children deserve to be. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what once existed. Before the mills, before the machines, before the shift whistle split the morning air like a blade, there was a different kind of childhood in America. Not perfect, not easy, but different in a way that matters deeply when you understand what replaced it. In the farming communities that stretched across the country in the early 1800s, children worked too. That is true. They helped with planting and harvesting. They fed animals. They carried wood. But that work happened inside a rhythm they knew. The rhythm of seasons, of daylight, of family. A child working beside their father in a field could stop when the sun was too hot, could look up and see the sky, could hear their mother calling from the farmhouse door when the midday meal was ready. The work was hard, but it breathed. Then something changed, and it changed fast, the way catastrophes always do. Not all at once, but in small steps that each seem reasonable until you look back and realize how far you have traveled. The Industrial Revolution arrived in America like a tide, and the mills rose along the riverbanks first, then spread inland, then multiplied until they were everywhere. And they needed workers, enormous numbers of workers, workers who were small enough to crawl under the machinery, workers who were docile enough to not complain, workers who were desperate enough to accept almost nothing in return. The families who sent their children to the mills were not monsters. That is something we must understand, deeply and with compassion. Before we go any further, they were families pushed to the edge by poverty, by debt, by the collapse of the agricultural economy, Irish immigrants fleeing famine, families ruined by crop failures, widowed mothers with nothing else to trade but the labor of their children. When a mill recruiter came to a village and offered to employ a 10-year-old for $1 a week, that dollar meant food. It meant the family didn't starve, and no parent who loves their child chooses the mill. They choose survival. The mill is what survival looks like when all other doors are closed. Close your eyes. Can you see it? A mother braiding her daughter's hair in the grey pre-dawn, her hands moving quickly, efficiently. The way hands move when there is no time for tenderness, and tenderness happens anyway, folded into every touch. She pins the braid tight so it won't get caught in the machinery. She doesn't say that out loud, she just pins it tight. The year is 1880. The town is Fall River, Massachusetts. Outside, the mill is already breathing. The great mechanical exhale of the looms starting up, vibrating through the cobblestones, through the walls of the tenement buildings, where the mill families sleep stacked on top of each other like cloth on a shelf. The child, let's call her Eliza, because she deserves a name. Eliza is 9 years old. She has been working in the mill for 6 months. She has already forgotten what it felt like to sleep until she was finished sleeping. If you know someone who grew up in a family where sacrifice was the daily bread, where childhood was shortened by necessity, not by choice, share this video with them, because Eliza's story is their story too, and it deserves to be heard. The sound. Let's start with the sound, because nothing prepares you for it. Nothing in a child's life, no thunderstorm, no church bell, no shouting in the street, prepares a child for the sound of a textile mill. It is not one sound. It is hundreds of sounds compressed into a single unbroken roar that you feel in your chest before you hear it. The clatter of the looms, the hiss of the steam engines, the screech of the belts running along the ceiling like mechanical rivers, the floor trembling constantly beneath your feet, and underneath all of it, barely audible but always there, the higher sound, the worry of the spindles. Thousands of them, each one pulling thread from a bobbin in an endless mechanical hunger. Children assigned to the spinning rooms were called spindle boys or spindle girls, but most were so small the distinction barely mattered. Their job was to watch the spindles, and whenever a thread broke, they had to reach in and reattach it. The machinery didn't stop. A child learned, very quickly, to read the space between the moving parts, the way a river swimmer reads the current. It was something faster than thought. Something that lives in the fingertips and the wrists and the soft flesh of the forearm. Lewis Hine, the photographer who documented child labor in America, wrote notes alongside his photographs that are almost impossible to read. One note describes a boy he photographed in a South Carolina cotton mill, 12 years old, working as a doctor. The boy's hands, Hine wrote, were already calloused and scarred. He had been working in that mill for 3 years. When Hine asked him if he liked his work, the boy looked at him with an expression that had no word in English for a child. The lint was everywhere. It was floating in the light that came through the high windows like something beautiful, like snow in the wrong season. Children breathed it all day, 12 hours of breathing it. Their lungs, still developing, absorbing particles that would settle permanently in their tissue. The disease they developed was called brown lung, bisonosis, and it moved slowly, the way rivers carve stone. Close your eyes. Can you smell it? The oil on the machines, thick and dark. The heat rising from the engines. A child standing in that room, eyes adjusting to the yellow light, ears ringing, hands moving automatically because they have learned to. Something that belonged to childhood has been traded for survival, and the trade is permanent. That child is no longer entirely a child. Something has changed inside them that cannot be changed back. Stay with me, because we are not finished yet. The physical toll of the mill was only part of the story. The other part was time, and what time, taken in this particular way, does to a human being who hasn't finished becoming one yet. There is a particular cruelty to the loss of time when you are a child. Adults who lose time to work lose hours from a life that is already substantially formed. They know who they are. But a child who loses time loses something different. They lose the process of becoming. The 12-hour shift in the mill was not just an exhausting day. It was 12 hours in which a child did not play, did not read, did not ask questions about the world, did not sit quietly and dream. They were not being tired. They were being unmade. The shifts typically ran from 5 in the morning to 7 at night, with a 30-minute break for a meal. Most children ate, standing near their machines because sitting down, truly sitting down, made it too hard to stand back up. The overseer moved through the rows with a combination of authority and impatience that left very little room for a child to be functional. Children who fell asleep standing were woken with cold water or with shouting or, in some cases, with a strike. But history is never simple. Children found each other. In the brief, blazing minutes of the lunch break, children found ways to be children. They developed small, quick games played with materials at hand, a piece of thread, a fragment of bobbin. They told each other stories. They kept track of each other's birthdays. They created, inside the machine, a small, warm world. Grace Abbott wrote that she was always struck by their laughter, sudden, surprising laughter erupting from nowhere between the rows. The mill had tried to turn them into small machines, and it had failed, because children are not machines. What was lost, though, was the education. In practice, a child working 12 hours a day had no school to attend. Illiteracy in the late 19th century was a locked door. It took their future. Close your eyes, can you hear it? The silence after the shift whistle sounds at 7 in the evening. A child walking home through the streets, feet aching, hands still moving slightly in the phantom motion of the work. They are walking toward the tenement, toward tomorrow, which will be the same as today. And somewhere inside that exhausted body, still something young, something that has not given up. History tends to tell the story of child labor reform as a story about adults, the photographers, the reformers, the politicians who eventually passed the laws. And those adults matter. Their courage matters. But the story is incomplete without the children themselves, who were not simply passive victims of a system. Some of them resisted. Some of them, in ways both small and extraordinary, pushed back. The textile strikes of the late 19th and early 20th centuries are often remembered as labor actions organized by adults. But children participated too. They walked off the job, joined picket lines, and shouted alongside older workers in the streets outside mill gates. In the famous Bread and Roses strike of 1912, children marched. They stood in the January cold outside the mill gates and refused to go inside. The strike was triggered by a wage reduction that pushed families into genuine desperation. The children understood what was at stake. Louis Hine deserves his own moment. Hine was a sociologist and photographer who began documenting child labor in 1908 for the National Child Labor Committee. He gained access to mills by posing as a Bible salesman or a fire inspector because the mill owners did not want their operations documented. What Hine produced was a body of photographic work that is among the most morally powerful ever created by an American artist. The children in his photographs look directly into the camera. They do not look away. They are not performing suffering. They simply exist. One photograph in particular has remained in the historical consciousness with unusual force. It shows a girl named Sadie Pfeifer in 1908. She stands between two rows of spinning frames that tower over her, the machinery stretching behind her into the hazy light. Her expression is serious. Her hair is tied back. Her dress is plain. And she looks at the camera with a profound directness. It is not anger, not sadness, not resignation. It is something more like, I am here, I exist, remember this. Florence Kelly, a relentless advocate, spent years documenting conditions to argue before legislators. She used these images to force change. She wrote that the question is not whether families need children's wages, but why an economy allows families to become so desperate. By 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act established federal minimum ages for employment. It took nearly 70 years for the law to catch up. 70 years, 2 full generations of children who grew up inside the machine before the machine was finally constrained. Close your eyes. Can you see Sadie Pfeifer standing between the spindles, looking at you across more than a century? She is still there. She is still looking. And the question she poses is one we have not yet fully answered. What is a child worth? What do we owe to every child the protection of their becoming? It was a question her era answered badly. We must answer it again. We are at the end of this story. Or rather, we are at the end of this episode, because stories like this one don't end. They transform. They move through time in ways that are invisible until, suddenly, they are visible again, in a different shape, in a different country. The children who worked in the American textile mills of the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s are gone. Their hands are gone. Their voices are gone. But the fabric they wove is still somewhere rotted now. Certainly, and what remains is the thread of their story, which we are responsible for holding. The clothes you are wearing right now, wherever you are watching this, were made by human hands. And the question of whose hands, and under what conditions, is a question that did not end with the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. It is alive today, in the garment factories of Bangladesh and Ethiopia, where children and adults work in conditions that would be familiar to Eliza. The geography has changed. The century has changed. The essential question has not. This is not a story designed to make you feel guilty for owning clothing. It is a story designed to make you feel curiosity, connection, responsibility. Those children were not abstract victims. They were specific. They had favorite foods and annoying siblings and things they were afraid of in the dark. And they had futures, real futures, that were taken from them by a system that decided their time was worth less than the fabric. Rosie, interviewed in 1938, had worked in a textile mill from the age of 8. She said the thing she missed most was the wandering time. The time when a child sits and doesn't know what they're thinking, when the mind goes somewhere on its own without a destination. When you look at a cloud or a crack in the ceiling and something happens in you that you can't put words to. That time, she said, was what the mill took from her. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, from the age of 8. All her wandering time. Close your eyes. Can you remember the last time you let your mind wander without purpose, without a screen, without a task waiting? That small, unclaimed space, that wandering time is what childhood is made of. It is where imagination lives. The children in the mills were denied it systematically, and their loss is a lesson that we have not yet finished learning. If this story moved you, if Sadie's photograph and Rosie's words have settled inside you, please share this video. Not for numbers, for Eliza, for Sadie. They deserve to be remembered as the people they were, and the people they were never allowed to become. This was another episode of Old Memories of America, keeping the flame of the past alive. Subscribe if you want to continue this journey with us. The past is waiting. Until the next episode.